A winter storm rolled across northern Minnesota, the night the nurses first noticed the dog in the hallway. Saint Gabriel Medical Center was already overcrowded with flu patients, exhausted staff, and families sleeping in waiting rooms when the old German Shepherd quietly appeared, outside room 214 just after midnight. Nobody saw where he came from. One security guard assumed the dog belonged to a visitor. Another thought maybe animal control had lost him nearby during the storm. But the strange part wasn't the dog itself. Hospitals occasionally dealt with therapy animals or emotional support pets. The strange part was what the dog did after arriving. He walked directly to room 214, laid down beside the door, and refused to leave. At first, the staff tried moving him gently. A young nurse brought food and water. Another employee checked nearby patient records, hoping to identify an owner. But every attempt failed. The shepherd ignored food, ignored strangers, ignored commands. He simply rested his tired body beside the hospital room entrance, lifting his head any time footsteps approached the door. The dog looked old. Gray fur spreading around the muzzle, scars visible beneath thinning black hair, one rear leg stiff from an old injury. Yet even while aging and exhausted, he carried the alert posture of a trained working animal, the kind military personnel instantly recognize. By the second night, several veterans visiting the hospital had already pointed it out quietly. "That dog served somewhere," one older Marine whispered while passing the hallway. "You can tell by the eyes." Inside room 214, an elderly patient named Walter Hayes remained unconscious after suffering a severe stroke 3 days earlier, 81 years old. No close family nearby. Former Army combat medic according to hospital paperwork. Most nurses expected the room to stay quiet because nobody ever came to visit him. No flowers. No phone calls. No relatives sitting beside the bed. Just silence. Machines beeping softly in the dark. And the old military dog sleeping outside the door every single night, like he was standing guard over someone the world forgot. Some hospital staff started calling the shepherd ghost because he moved so quietly through the hallways. Others became uncomfortable by how focused the dog seemed on room 214 specifically. One overnight janitor swore the animal became restless anytime doctors entered the room, pacing slowly until they left again. By the fourth night, the story had spread through nearly the entire hospital. Patients asked about the mysterious dog. Nurses took photographs secretly during shifts. One local reporter even called the front desk after hearing rumors online about the loyal shepherd outside room 214. But nobody understood the truth because nobody had opened Walter Hayes' old military records yet. Nobody knew that 53 years earlier, during the Vietnam War, Walter served alongside military K-9 evacuation units responsible for locating wounded soldiers deep inside combat zones. And nobody knew something even stranger. The retired military dog sleeping outside his hospital room wasn't random at all. The shepherd knew exactly who Walter Hayes was. Every night, around 2 in the morning, the dog would slowly stand, walk to the door of room 214, and gently press his nose against the small glass window before laying back down again, like he was checking whether the old soldier inside was still breathing. Nurse Emily Carter noticed the pattern first during overnight rounds. 32 years old, divorced, working double shifts to pay medical debt after her younger brother's cancer treatments, Emily had seen enough grief inside hospitals to stop believing in coincidences. The dog's behavior bothered her in a way she couldn't explain, especially because every time she entered Walter's room to check vitals, the shepherd watched her with painful intensity, almost like he was evaluating whether she could be trusted. Then came the 7th night. Snow hammered the hospital windows while emergency rooms overflowed downstairs. Emily walked toward room 214, carrying fresh medication when she noticed something different immediately. The shepherd wasn't laying down. He stood rigid near the door, ears raised, low growl vibrating through his chest. Emily froze. "Easy, boy," she whispered softly. But the dog ignored her completely, staring only at the room itself. The growl deepened. Then suddenly the shepherd scratched hard against the hospital door and barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Emily's pulse jumped instantly, because until that moment, nobody at Saint Gabriel had heard the dog bark even a single time. She rushed into the room. And what she saw made her blood run cold. Walter Hayes was gone. The hospital bed sat empty, beneath flickering monitor lights. The window beside the bed hung partially open, despite the freezing storm outside, and resting on the pillow, where the old veteran's head should have been, was an old military photograph showing a much younger Walter standing beside another German shepherd in combat gear. Written across the bottom in faded ink were 5 words that changed everything. For several seconds, Emily Carter couldn't move. Snow blew through the partially opened hospital window, scattering loose medical papers across the empty room, while heart monitor wires hung disconnected beside the bed. Walter Hayes, an 81-year-old stroke patient who could barely sit upright 2 days earlier, had somehow disappeared in the middle of a blizzard. But what unsettled Emily most wasn't the missing patient. It was the dog. The old German shepherd stood perfectly still beside the doorway, staring toward the open window with an expression that looked disturbingly human, focused, waiting. Almost expectant. Then the shepherd suddenly turned and hurried down the hallway. Emily reacted instantly. "Security!" she shouted while running after him. Nurses stepped out of patient rooms in confusion as the dog moved quickly through the hospital corridors despite his injured rear leg. Security guards joined the search within moments, assuming Walter had wandered off during a confused medical episode, but Emily already knew something about this situation didn't fit. Sick elderly patients don't vanish through second-floor windows during snowstorms, and they definitely don't leave behind military photographs with cryptic handwritten messages. The shepherd led them toward the rear emergency stairwell near the older side of the hospital. By the time Emily pushed through the heavy door behind him, snow-covered wind was rushing upward from below. One of the emergency exits downstairs had been forced open. Fresh footprints disappeared into the storm outside. 2 sets, 1 human, 1 dog. Emily stared at the tracks in disbelief. Walter walked out there? A security officer muttered. "That's impossible." But deep down, Emily wasn't sure anymore. Because impossible things had been happening around room 214 all week. The search lasted nearly 3 hours. Police units scanned nearby streets, while hospital staff checked shelters, bus stations, and emergency warming centers across the city. But no sign of Walter Hayes appeared anywhere. The storm swallowed every trail by sunrise. Back inside Saint Gabriel Medical Center, Emily sat alone in the staff lounge, staring at the military photograph recovered from Walter's bed. The younger version of Walter looked barely 25 years old, standing in jungle fatigues beside a military K9 almost identical to the shepherd from the hallway. On the back of the photograph, faded military handwriting revealed another sentence investigators nearly missed. "Me and Scout. Quang Tri Province, 1972. Emily searched the name during break, using old military archive websites. 30 minutes later, her heartbeat slowed. Scout wasn't just a military dog. According to declassified Vietnam War records, Scout belonged to a specialized Army K9 recovery unit, responsible for locating wounded soldiers during combat operations. Several reports specifically mentioned Staff Sergeant Walter Hayes and Scout performing rescue missions together near Quang Tri Province after ambushes deep in hostile territory. One article described Scout as the dog who refused to abandon injured soldiers even under active gunfire. Another mentioned Walter receiving commendation medals after carrying wounded men out of combat zones beside the shepherd during nighttime evacuations. Then Emily found the final report, October 1972. An extraction mission went wrong during heavy fighting. Scout disappeared during the operation. Officially listed as killed in action. Walter Hayes reportedly spent nearly 16 hours searching enemy territory trying to recover the dog before being ordered to retreat. The last line of the report made Emily's chest tighten. Sergeant Hayes refused evacuation until physically restrained by his commanding officer. Suddenly, the sentence written on the photograph felt less mysterious. "You promised you'd come back." That afternoon, Emily visited Walter's empty hospital room again. Police investigators had already searched everything, but something kept bothering her about the old veteran's behavior before disappearing. Room 214 no longer felt abandoned. It felt unfinished. Slowly, she opened the bedside drawer containing Walter's personal belongings collected after admission. Reading glasses, a wallet, old military bracelet, and beneath folded clothes, a sealed envelope with her name, written carefully across the front. Emily froze, hands shaking slightly. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 3 days earlier. "If you're reading this, then Scout came for me like I knew he would." Emily sat slowly on the edge of the hospital bed while reading the rest. Walter explained that shortly after his stroke, he started dreaming about Vietnam again for the first time in decades. Not nightmares, memories. Scout running through jungle rain. Soldiers calling for medics. Gunfire in darkness. Then, according to Walter, the old dog appeared outside his hospital room 3 nights later, exactly as he looked during the war. Older now, scarred by time, but unmistakably Scout. At first, Walter believed the stroke damaged his mind, until the dog responded to hand signals only Scout would recognize. Emily kept reading while snow drifted softly outside the window. Everybody thinks military dogs forget once wars end. They don't. Some stay loyal longer than humans do. Scout waited 53 years, because I never made it back for him that night. Emily's eyes slowly lifted from the page, because suddenly she understood something heartbreaking. Walter didn't think the dog outside room 214 reminded him of Scout. He believed it actually was Scout. And somehow, part of Emily was beginning to wonder too. The final paragraph of the letter nearly brought tears to her eyes. "He didn't come back because he was lost. He came back because I was, at exactly 7:40 that evening, a state trooper called the hospital with new information. An elderly man matching Walter Hayes' description had been spotted nearly 6 miles north of Saint Gabriel, near an abandoned veterans' campground beside frozen woods. Witnesses reported seeing him walking slowly through the snow with a German shepherd beside him." Emily didn't wait for permission. She grabbed her coat and drove into the storm herself, because deep down she already knew this wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a promise finally being kept. The abandoned veterans' campground sat deep beyond the northern tree line, where the storm had nearly erased the road completely. Snow covered the cabins, picnic tables, and broken wooden signs scattered around the frozen property, making the entire place feel forgotten by time itself. Emily Carter's car barely made it through the final stretch before the tires lost traction near the entrance gate. By then, night had already fallen again. Police vehicles flashed through heavy snowfall farther down the trail, while search teams moved carefully with flashlights between the trees. But Emily ignored the officers calling after her. The moment she saw the footprints leading deeper into the woods, 2 sets, 1 human, 1 dog, fresh. Her heartbeat pounded as she followed the tracks through the storm until distant voices suddenly echoed ahead. A search officer waved toward a clearing near the frozen lake. "Over here!" Emily pushed through the snow-covered branches and stopped cold. Walter Hayes sat quietly beneath an old wooden shelter facing the frozen lake. wrapped in his hospital blanket while snow gathered across his shoulders. Beside him lay the German shepherd from room 214. The old dog rested calmly with his head against Walter's leg, both of them staring out across the dark frozen water, like they had been sitting there for hours waiting for someone to arrive. Neither looked afraid. Neither tried to run. Walter slowly turned when he heard Emily approach. His face looked tired but peaceful in a way she had never seen inside the hospital room. "I knew he'd bring somebody eventually," the old veteran said softly. Emily struggled to catch her breath. "Walter, everybody's been looking for you." The old man nodded faintly before looking down at the shepherd beside him. He used to bring medics to wounded soldiers exactly the same way. Several officers approached carefully behind Emily, but the moment one stepped too close, the shepherd lifted his head and growled low enough to stop them instantly. Walter gently rested a shaking hand against the dog's neck. "Easy, Scout," he whispered. The growling stopped immediately. Emily stared at the old dog again, while cold wind moved through the trees around them. The shepherd looked exhausted now, weaker than before, breathing slow and uneven beneath snow-covered fur. For the first time, Emily noticed how thin the dog actually was beneath the thick coat. "How old?" Walter looked toward the frozen lake again before speaking quietly. "This place used to be an army recovery camp after Vietnam. They brought wounded soldiers here before sending them home." His voice cracked slightly after that. "Scout and I passed through here once in '73. Emily sat beside him slowly in the snow. "Walter, that dog can't really be." "Scout?" Walter smiled sadly before she finished. "No, not exactly." The answer caught her off guard. The old veteran looked down at the shepherd beside him, with tears gathering quietly in his eyes. "Scout died a long time ago." He paused briefly. "But this dog belonged to the man who found him." Emily frowned slightly. Walter took a long breath before explaining the truth nobody at the hospital knew. Nearly 20 years after Vietnam, a former military ranger named Daniel Foster contacted Walter unexpectedly. During a hiking trip near old combat territory overseas, Daniel discovered a starving German shepherd wandering near abandoned military ruins. The dog carried faded Army K9 markings connected to Vietnam-era operations. Daniel eventually learned the shepherd descended from military breeding lines tied directly to Scout's original unit. More importantly, according to Walter, the dog behaved exactly like Scout, same signals, same patrol patterns, same habits. Daniel became convinced the animal had been trained by handlers who preserved old military command routines across generations of working dogs. Over time, Walter and Daniel stayed close friends through veterans programs, and Walter quietly visited the shepherd often after retirement. Then, 3 years ago, Daniel Foster died from cancer. The dog disappeared shortly afterward. Emily slowly looked toward the aging shepherd resting beside Walter. "So he came looking for you?" Walter nodded softly. He remembered my scent. Tears finally rolled down the old veteran's face after that. Dogs don't understand death the way we do. To them, loyalty keeps going. Snow fell quietly around the frozen campground while officers lowered their flashlights, realizing the situation wasn't dangerous at all. Just heartbreaking. Then Emily noticed something else. The shepherd's breathing had become shallow, very shallow. Walter noticed too. The old man gently stroked the dog's fur while whispering softly, "You waited long enough, old boy." Emily's chest tightened instantly, because suddenly she understood the truth. The dog hadn't come to save Walter. He came to say goodbye. For several long minutes, nobody spoke. Search officers stood silently beneath falling snow while the old military dog rested beside the last soldier connected to the handler he once loved. Then, slowly, the shepherd lifted his head one final time and looked toward Walter. The old veteran smiled through tears. "You kept your promise," he whispered. The dog's tail moved gently once against the snow. Then he closed his eyes peacefully and didn't open them again. Even the officers nearby lowered their heads after realizing what they had just witnessed. Emily quietly wiped tears from her face, while Walter remained sitting beside the shepherd in silence, one trembling hand still resting against the old dog's neck. After a long time, the veteran finally spoke again. "People think war ends when soldiers come home." His voice sounded distant now. "Truth is, some parts never do." The following week, Saint Gabriel Medical Center received hundreds of letters after local news stations shared the story of the mysterious military dog outside room 214. Veterans groups from across the country contacted Walter Hayes personally. One retired Marine donated funds to build a memorial bench near the hospital garden, honoring military working dogs and their handlers. Another former Army medic paid for the shepherd's burial beside a veteran's cemetery overlooking the same frozen lake where Walter found him. But the moment Emily Carter never forgot happened 3 days later during the burial ceremony. As military honors concluded and snow drifted softly across the cemetery, Walter Hayes slowly stood from his wheelchair and saluted the old shepherd's grave with trembling hands. Not one veteran present lowered their salute until he did. Months later, Emily still sometimes walked past room 214 during overnight shifts and remembered the dog sleeping quietly outside the door, like a soldier guarding someone the world almost forgot. The hospital eventually placed a framed photograph in the hallway showing Walter seated beside the shepherd near the frozen lake on the final night. Beneath it, a small brass plate carried the sentence everyone at Saint Gabriel remembered most. And every winter after that, whenever snowstorms covered the city and silence settled across the hospital hallways late at night, nurses still swore they sometimes heard soft paw steps outside room 214. Some bonds survive war, some survive time, and sometimes loyalty waits decades for one final goodbye. If this story touched your heart, stay with us for the next journey, because the truest soldiers are often the ones who never stop coming back.